Hi there, I'm Annie Fadley. I work on policy here at Civic Ventures, and I also help produce this podcast. So one of our favorite recent episodes here at Pitchfork Economics was, should Democrats appeal to the center by moving hard left? And Nick talked to Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal in her offices in Washington, D.C. for that episode. She is our representative here in Seattle, and she's also the leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and we just love her. But we didn't have time to include everything they talked about, so here's their unedited conversation. Enjoy.
So we're just going to begin to chat.
Yeah.
And this is going to be both a podcast and a catch-up. Okay. Hi, Pramila Jayapal. Would you please introduce yourself?
I will. It's great to be with you. I'm Pramila Jayapal, and I am the Congresswoman representing Washington's 7th District, longtime activist and advocate, and thrilled to be working with you on all the things that matter.
Yeah, and Pramila and I go way back. We did a lot of fun things together over the years in Seattle, where she's from. Among them, the $15 minimum wage, and I should just say that it was really. That was a journey. It was a journey and a learning experience. And for my own part, you know, one of the things that I was as I reflect back on that experience, you love to think about what you thought was right and what was wrong and where you were wrong. And one of the ways in which I was most wrong were my views on tipped workers. You may. Yeah,
I remember that.
Yeah, and you know, I came into that conversation, into that effort, feeling pretty strongly that tipped workers should be treated differently than other workers. And Pramila and a bunch of other people strongly disagreed with me. And I can say safely and confidently now that I was dead wrong about that.
I think that's pretty amazing. I mean, I remember you told me that sort of the December right after all of those discussions. We were on an end of the year panel. And, you know, and I think that some of it, your voice has been so important because you actually, you know, you always say, I'm a proud, successful capitalist and I've made money, and you bring that lens to why raising the minimum wage or these issues that we're dealing with around poverty and economic issues matter. And I think we're all developing the right set of language to talk about these issues and some of our views around it. And, you know, I don't know if we did enough that go around small businesses. Like I think we had the Small Business Main Street Coalition, but I really think that as I talk to more and more small businesses, even on policies like Medicare for All, it's been kind of amazing for me to hear people say, I disagree with you on everything. Small business Republicans who say, I disagree with you on everything, including, by the way, minimum wage. Yeah. But I really want you to pass a Medicare for All policy because I have 10 employees. I don't mind paying into something, but I don't want to go find healthcare for my employees. And so, I mean, I just feel like it, you know, we're fortunate to have you in the region and to be able to have this conversation around not just what is the right policy, but also what is the right language. And we've used some of your, you know, I've been testing this centrist idea and taking back the use of the word centrist, which you wrote an excellent essay on. And, you know, and I'm constantly trying to tweak it, but I think that's the value of these conversations. And 15, I feel like there isn't even a conversation now here in Congress that 15 is the right level. Yeah. And that's, you know, like high five on that because we did that. And not we, just you and me, but we the movement and fast food workers and low wage workers across the country who have changed the reality. And so I'm here in Congress because I believe that if politics is the art of the possible, then our role is to try to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible.
Hell yes. Yeah, and I want to touch on a couple of things that you said. First, the intersection of policy and narrative. And I think, you know, what strikes me looking back on the fight over tipped wages and $15 minimum wage that's so salient is that not only is, you know, eliminating the tip whatever they call it, the tip credit or the tip penalty, which is more accurate. A good policy that, in fact, these folks should be paid adequately irrespective of tips. And if they get tips more, all the better. And that, in fact, restaurants won't do worse when this happens. Restaurants will do better when it happens because, of all things, when restaurants pay restaurant workers enough so that even they can afford to eat in restaurants, it turns out to be pretty good for the restaurant business. But what was even more of a surprise that I really didn't understand at the time was how powerful, how useful and powerful that is as part of the narrative. And here's why. Because when we contrast what we're doing in Seattle for restaurants, which is paying people $15 an hour plus tips, with what they're doing in, Alabama, which is $2.13 plus tips, what we can show is that we're running a natural experiment where the difference in wages isn't 7% or 70%, it's 700%. Right. And so if that's not as stark an experiment as you can run, I don't know what is. And clearly, all the McDonald's in Washington State have not gone out of business, right? That, in fact, we have more restaurants per capita in high-wage Seattle than they do in low-wage Alabama. And that serves to prove, I think, in a much more important and stark way, why these policies make sense.
Right. And I was thinking about, how we had so many restaurant owners that came to us and were like, we're going to shut down. And then a year later, after we passed the policy, even 2 years later, they're all doing really well. They're all opening new restaurants. And the narrative around how this is going to kill us has been proven to be false. Right. And I think the tipped wage was interesting because, for listeners who don't know this, Washington State has been at the forefront of this movement. I mean, we're one of the very few states that didn't have a tipped wage. And so for those tipped workers, for the movement that was trying to make sure we didn't have a tipped wage, because they saw these differences in wages across the states with the federal tipped wage being so low, they felt like we were giving up the narrative that you could do well without a tipped wage. And in the end, when I went to the state Senate right after we passed 15, it was interesting because there was actually no financial reason for them to agree to the deal the way we laid it out, because they were actually paying more by doing the scheme that we laid out, but it allowed them to say that they were negotiating for a tipped wage. It was a period of time, it was temporary, but that was the narrative they wanted. Now I think we've held strong, and it hasn't led to all the things that people were afraid it would lead to, and it got us 15. But I think we learned from that, and I think that it's been inspiring for people to see not just that we could do it, but also that it's helped our economy grow. I mean, what you've always said, what we've always talked about is workers have more money, they spend more, that's good for the economy, businesses do better. That cycle, we just have to keep thinking about. And I just wrote a piece that'll come out in January on the working poor. And I was thinking about this idea that really what we have to do is transform the way we think about workers, so that workers are not the drain on companies, but they are actually the valued, how did I say it? I forget now, I'd have to go back and look, but the valued, they are the valued driver engine, the valued engine of profitability and growth for companies, and then taking your same narrative again. But that is a dynamic shift in how we see workers, because people say, oh no, we can't increase the minimum wage, or we can't give people benefits, or we can't do this, or we can't pay overtime because it's too expensive. But no, actually, you don't get growth if you don't have workers who are driving that growth. And so the profits have to be shared in a very different and equitable fashion than they have been.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about is strictly not neoliberalism, I would say.
Right.
One of the most profound lessons of organizing for the $15 minimum wage, just sort of pathetically obvious when you consider it, is that contrary to a lot of instincts from activists on the left, in a weird way, the farther we went, the easier it got. Mm-hmm. This is one of the profound lessons of the $15 minimum wage, is you can't have a fight for $7.75. Right.
Right, totally. I totally agree with you. It's like, and now, 15 felt far at the time, but it's really not far enough, right? I mean, if inflation had kept pace, we would be, if wages had kept pace with inflation, we would be at 21, 22, and depending on what state you're in, more than that. And so.
Right. If you raise the minimum wage from $7.25, which is the federal minimum, to $7.75, you help a few people in the bottom 1 or 2 deciles. In 2012, when we first started talking about this, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour included the bottom 45% of workers or something like that. It may have been slightly more. So you absolutely have people's attention. And that lesson has turned into a new conversation that you and I have had about what the true meaning of centrism is. Because what 40 years of neoliberalism taught the Democratic Party, if we're being honest, is that centrism is found when you balance the economic interests of the richest people who hold 50% of the income against everyone else in the country who owns the other 50% of the income. And of course, if you put that on a ruler, that fulcrum is found 0.3 of 1 inch from the right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and this came about because I think I was at a conference where I was talking about how these progressive policies aren't really progressive. I'm proud to be called a progressive, but they're not radical. And I think you said, no, they're actually centrist because they serve the center of the country. Why should centrism mean that the top 1% or the wealthiest corporations are getting all of the benefit? Why wouldn't centrism mean serving the center? And I love that because I was an English major in college and I was thinking about etymology and I'm like, yeah, centrist should mean center. And so I've been taking that around the country and trying that. I used it as speech in Iowa. I've used it in some places. And we still have to tweak it a little bit, but I think, so the opportunity of that is that there is a fair amount of research that shows that people love these progressive ideas, whatever you want to call them, right? These ideas we're talking about, raising the minimum wage, overtime pay.
Yeah, fair wages, reasonable health care costs, affordable college, a decent place to live that doesn't bankrupt you. It's so weird how people prefer those things.
It's amazing, right? And it's not just progressives or young people, it's actually Republicans and independents.
Everybody.
Everyone wants the same thing. And so, and sometimes there is this push to say, well, this person is progressive, but I started a Medicare for All PAC, and I actually endorsed a couple of people who are not in the progressive caucus, but ran on Medicare for All. And I think we do have to think about, and there are some people who are like, no, don't say centrist, because that's talking about the centrism that is. But we've reclaimed a lot of words in our narrative. Yeah. We've done that on racial justice. We've done that on so many things. We can reclaim this and make centrism mean center, serving the center, not serving that fulcrum at the end.
And we of course need to always be thinking about taking care of the most disadvantaged people in our society. But it is a terrible political policy and economic mistake to make the rich richer every day and occasionally throw a bone to the very poor. Right. Our policies should directly, unambiguously, and significantly improve the lives of the bottom 9 deciles of Americans who have been left out of the last 40 years of economic growth. Right. And to me, that's what centrism is. Medicare for All is centrism. Raising the overtime threshold to include the bottom 80% of workers is centrism. Moving the minimum wage up to the median wage is centrism. Right. These are centrist ideas because they will unambiguously improve the lives of the median family, which should be our goal.
Right. And so much of what's happened as inequality has grown is that, yes, we have these programs that serve the most vulnerable, the poorest, and we need to have those. But increasingly, there's this giant band between that poverty threshold and the top 10%. And those people can't survive. They don't
And
have opportunity.
They have been forgotten.
They have been forgotten. And if you look at the statistic that keeps me up at night is 62% of Americans don't even have $1,000 in their bank account. 45% of Americans can't even deal with a $400 emergency. That's a leak, in your roof. That's your car breaks down. That's your kid gets sick and you have to take a couple days off from work and you don't live in Washington State where you get paid medical leave. It's any of those things. And so this anxiety is ever present for 90% of people. And for me, that also is the opening for then the blaming that somebody like Donald Trump taps into, right? Because he taps into working people who feel like they've sort of been doing everything right. Like they got a job, they're working 40 hours a week. Now more and more they're working 2 jobs. They don't have money to send their kids to college because education is so costly now. They are worried about their Social Security because they're afraid it's going to be cut. They're one healthcare crisis away from bankruptcy. Housing has gone through the roof. They can't pay for housing. And they're like, wait a second, you want to talk about immigrants? What about me? And so it leads to this place where people get divided. And I think the more we can point out that the only people that benefit from any of the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric, or the cuts to Social Security or any of these things are the people at the very top.
Very rich people, for sure. Myself included, I should add.
Well, that's why you're so unusual, because you're willing to say that. And I will say that there are, and we have some of these folks in Washington State, a lot of really wealthy people who don't want to have this either. They know that your future is not going to be good if we devolve into a country where literally only 10% of the people, if that, have opportunity.
Yeah, if America falls apart, it will suck to be rich too.
Yeah, there'll be a revolution. There will be a revolution, and guess who's going to be the target of that?
Exactly. Yeah, and so how do we talk the Democratic Party, and ideally a bunch of the Republican Party, into this notion that the purpose of politics is to unambiguously improve the lives of the median family? Like, I would just admit that I'm about to have dinner with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and a bunch of people to talk about the future of the Democratic Party in one of these big dinners. What should I say to them?
Well, I think you should, first of all, point out that people won across the country and we took control of the House because of bold ideas, not because anyone was talking about a 25-cent increase to the minimum wage, but because people were talking about, even in swing districts, ideas like Medicare for All. I think you should talk about the centrism of these ideas. I think you should talk about the fact that we have a situation of crisis where people don't trust either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party because there's so much money in politics. Now, it'll be awkward because you'll be at a dinner which is, about donors to the Democratic Party. But I think that, we have some big pieces of legislation around anti-corruption. But I also think, for me, I don't know if this is something you want to say tonight, but for me, one of the things that I've been trying to do is think about how you use elected office to drive a conversation and to drive a narrative versus following a bunch of polling that is often not really...
Amen to that.
Not useful, but also not fair, not just, right? Because if you look at, and not that I want us to do what Trump is doing, but if you look at what Trump does, he just has a narrative and then he pushes that out there. After the Kavanaugh hearings, all of a sudden it was all about the unfairness to Kavanaugh. He didn't care about the polling. The polling did not say that at all. But he used his bully pulpit to frame and change the narrative. How do we as Democrats get bolder about actually framing a narrative? Because I think for a lot of people, and I see it even in our district, for people that aren't up on the issues as you are, people look to me and to this office and to us for a frame. How do we think about this problem? How do we think about the border? How do we think about immigration? How do we think about healthcare? So we have a real opportunity to use our platforms to really drive a narrative. And that, in some ways, is one of the biggest things that I think Democrats need to harness, is to be bold and to understand that our wins did not come from people having incremental positions, even in districts that elected swing, or more conservative Democrats. It was indivisibles that turned out. It was Black women. It was young people. It was people who were excited about potentially not even that candidate, but maybe a candidate up ticket, maybe a Stacey Abrams, maybe a Beto O'Rourke. And so the analysis has to be right. And the analysis has to take us towards the country is moving to common sense / progressive / centrist in our meaning of the word, proposals, transformations in our economy. One other thing, we've got to pay attention to monopolies, antitrust, corporate buybacks. I mean, if you look at what has happened with inequality, when we stopped enforcing the no corporate buyback rules, you really saw inequality increase dramatically. And instead of money going into wages for workers, it went into these stock buybacks. And so I think that there are a few different pieces here that Democrats have been unwilling to take on, but we really have to take on antitrust monopoly stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And for another conversation, we will discuss the big policy that we dropped yesterday, which is called Progressive Labor Standards, where we attempt to deal with some of this. But so, Pramila, am I crazy to think that if Democrats, or frankly, any elected official, just did more for their constituents, they would need less from their donors? I mean, isn't that the problem with the Democratic Party? It's been so long since we made a big difference in people's lives that they see Democrats as feckless corporate stooges too, which is fair, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I tell everybody who comes in as a new member that constituent services is one of the most important things you can do. And we got back $1.5 million for our constituents. We helped over 800 people. It was crazy. Like, just having my name on a letter helps people navigate the system. But I also think it's about, we have work to do to really leverage the power of the progressive movement. I just got elected the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. We have more progressive members than we've ever had before. 40% of the caucus are members of the CPC. We just set up the CPCC, this 501c3 and C4 that can be this intersection between the outside organizing and the inside organizing. You saw that work a little bit with the speakers when Leader Pelosi is running for speaker now, and we were able to work with the outside groups to sort of leverage, look, here are our asks. We realized we have very few progressives on most of the exclusive committees. That's where the decisions get made. Ways and Means, appropriations we were not bad on, energy and commerce, hardly anybody. Financial services, one person left. Intelligence, one person left. So, really thinking, and we worked with the progressive groups and said, hold your endorsement, let us get proportional representation plus a few other things, and we will use our power, we will leverage our power, and we can do that with our donors as well. We really want to see the Democratic Party move in a way that really addresses this. And by the way, it's not identity politics versus economics. That frame just drives me nuts. And so we just have to keep pushing back on that, because I think there are a lot of people who are afraid to talk about race, a lot of people who think that these are ancillary questions. Don't get into the immigration questions. Well, you know what? It's been put on the table by the president. So, good luck not getting into them. So, I mean, that's all the work we have to do. And I am excited about it because I feel like we have this real opportunity to leverage the outside, the inside, donors and, powerful ideas that are out there, and just to seize that narrative.
Well, Pramila, thank you so much for being with us today. Super fun to be in your snazzy office. I just should mention that the Cannon House office building is someplace between a ghost town and a haunted house. Every office, we whooped them, and the offices are empty.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of turned over furniture. It's kind of spooky. So
No, it is spooky because we're in the process of moving, and actually we will be moving because they are doing construction on this wing. So we are moving over to Longworth, and so we haven't been given our moving date, which is why ours still looks relatively lived in and not crazy. But yeah, there's furniture in the halls for anybody that's trying to imagine what it's like. A lot of construction, furniture in the halls, everyone's moving, 40 members that lost their seats that are moving out. So it's always a weird time. 2 years ago this time, thanks to you and people in the 7th, I got to be moving in, and it was a super exciting time for people who are moving in. But I remember thinking, wow, this really sucks for people who have lost their elections and have to move out. But Nick, thank you for everything you do and for the ideas and for the vision and the passion of the work.
thank you. All right, that was fantastic. And we actually got to have a fun conversation.
We really did.
Pitchfork Economics is produced by Civic Ventures. The magic happens in Seattle in partnership with Large Media. That's LARJ Media and the Young Turks Network. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Civic Action, follow our writing on Medium at Civic Skunkworks, and peek behind the podcast scenes on Instagram at Pitchfork Economics. And one more, you should definitely follow Nick on Twitter at Nick Hanauer. See you next week.
Thank you guys. Yeah, Nick, anything that you want to add?
No, you put me on the spot. No.